Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is really exciting. Quite a different format for us all. So we're just kind of trying to play with this idea of being sort of digitally together, but obviously I think we're sort of trying to make it a bit like a visual radio show, and we'll tell you a bit more about that. So just to say, Joseph and I are really good friends, and even though we're colleagues, our friendship has grown talking about inequality in the built environment, being people of colour within the built environment, and also our love for music. So this sort of sound advice started as a kind of continuation of that. You can follow us on Instagram. Our kind of tags are here. And Joseph, do you want to talk more about what sound advice is?
Yes. So we first originated after being asked by Afterparti for their first zine, who was sort of a ethnic minority-led magazine writing collective who started out of the New Architecture Writers Programme, which is a programme from the Architecture Foundation. And we were kind of interested in sort of, as Pooja and I are slightly older than the people that were part of Afterparti, we thought it'd be interesting to write some tips for like our younger selves about sort of some of the experiences we've had being ethnic minority architects in the built environment, and we sort of wrote an article. But we accompanied each tip with a song, so a song for the mood that you might want to have to deal with that situation. And that's sort of where the concept of bringing together the sort of advice that would sort of the humour to explore interesting, but also sort of ideas that need to be talked about, using humour to open that conversation, and then using music as a way of conveying how we may or may not feel at that point. So we'll head straight into, it's also worth saying, because you said this, that we're not here representing the Greater London Authority.
Yeah, but, very important to say that we're here as individuals, and it's quite like tongue-in-cheek, so definitely not representing the mayor.
We're not, at this point, okay. So the first tip is self-isolation at home isn't that hard, just use the spare bathroom.
So I think one of the key things that's really sort of come out at this kind of lockdown period is the inequality in housing. And as sort of architects or planners and working in the built environment, we're so close to this situation, yet I think in the last few years, there's been such a pressure on housing numbers. You know, politically, all we hear is targets and like, how many homes are we going to build this year? How many homes are we going to build this year? And suddenly we're all locked up in this number. And, you know, we've forgotten to talk about what it feels like to be at home and what does this home mean for different people?
Yeah, and I think that the focus on quality of life that you can get through your home is really important. And actually the value system that determines the quality of a house being less about the ability to secure yield, actually what does it feel like? So actually being and staying in a property that is built to space design standards is actually wholly inadequate for two adults to actually work together during this period, because one of us has to end up either sat in a bed or on a windowsill, because everything, kitchen, living, dining, or your whole life is decided that it's okay to fit it in 27 square meters of space. And in addition to that, most bedrooms don't have the space to actually fit a desk once you put your storage into it. So I guess it's interesting actually living this experience of like how good our own policy does, like life to life in this process.
Yeah, and I guess somewhere it feels like when these policies are being made or we're being told how to live, it's almost done with the very kind of concept of what a traditional family is, a traditional home is. It feels like, there's the 2-bedroom house with the kind of Victorian setup with your little private garden in the back, and we are, especially in cities or places like London, obviously, we've forgotten how so many people are living in shared rentals. And when they talk about you can only go outside as a household, what does that mean when there's sort of 6 people living or students sharing their homes, or issues of kind of overcrowding? How do you sort of start to self-isolate when you're sharing one tiny bathroom between 8 people?
Yeah, and I think there's a lack of granular knowledge about how people live their lives, and the sort of an outcome of that can be interesting. So, for example, there's a borough who overprovided primary schools. They were building so many 3-bedroom flats and houses, assuming that families were living there, but actually it was just 3 single people sharing a family unit. So they started building and investing in all these primary schools. There weren't the young people there to actually take it. So there's this interesting sort of the people that are making policy and who are sort of collecting data have one way of thinking, but actually the reality of the city and how people live is often way more complex and fragmented. And I think this has started to show the importance of actually collecting data and being open to the way people actually live, rather than how you want to project certain lifestyles onto the typology. People occupy things as they want.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what you said in the beginning, this idea of like quality of life, suddenly just like light becomes so important. And like architects, we talk about space and light and sound so much, but I think this is like a really good opportunity for us to kind of be able to communicate this to people who are not architects or not working in the built environment, how really simple things like getting fresh air and kind of cross ventilation and not having just sort of single aspect north facing units, what a difference that means and what the value we bring as designers to the housing market is.
Or just small things like I'm on the 6th floor of a flat and the balconies, one of those balconies that projects out. And someone who's scared of heights, that means suddenly there's an piece of outside space I can't actually access or use because I don't feel secure in it. And it's amazing how many people you don't see occupying the outside space they do have, because it's either windswept or it's terrifying to be up there. So there's things like that suddenly I will always bring up in design reviews that I never would have done previously.
I think like space standards is another interesting thing to talk about. I feel like there's such an obvious argument for and against them. Often it's like if you don't have these sort of basic space standards, people are going to always abuse them, trying to make your house as small as possible, right? But at the same time, if you're a really good architect, sometimes you can feel quite constrained with these standards saying, you have to have X amount of storage and you have to have X amount of this, but what if there was a communal storage space or there was a communal area? You know, these sort of how much of it is kind of policy and how much of it is that you give architects freedom to sort of explore this is another thing that I think we can start to sort of question more as we move into kind of the post-lockdown world of what a home means to us.
And there's also something interesting about the fact that the first thing the government wanted to do was create a mortgage holiday for homeowners, but didn't actually talk about the rental market, which is a significant part of the housing market. So you end up having people who own multiple properties having mortgage holidays, but the renters subsidizing these mortgage holidays. So again, it'd be interesting to know if there were more people that delivered policy that lived in rental accommodation, whether that would have changed the focus on the government to sort of suddenly provide mortgage holidays. And it also shows there's a lack of ability to regulate. It's easier to regulate mortgages than it is to regulate the rented sector. So it might also be a reason why that sort of shows the reforms that are needed imminently.
I think we're already probably, yeah. Let's do it.
All right. So we're keeping this idea of songs linked to it. So the first song is a song by Heady One called Both. And I think the reason why the song was picked is it starts to, it's sort of is about like trying to navigate sort of two extremities. And I think as some of the work that we do at the GLA is always trying to balance sort of inherent policy tension. So delivering housing numbers, but also dealing with a climate crisis. And everything, the answer always is somewhere in the grey, somewhere in the middle. So I quite like the fact this song for its like sort of moral and sort of ethical ambiguity it sort of sits in the middle. So we'll play the same. We will be sharing the playlist at the end of this, so all songs will be, and I'm sure we can share this like actual document itself with the Architecture Foundation if you want to watch the songs to the end or hear the songs to the end.
Cool. So tip number 2, stop, think, and don't light that barbecue on your balcony.
So I guess this is referring to sort of the access to green spaces and access to green public space that's become into sort of the forefront of everyone's minds through the lockdown. So who owns a garden, who doesn't? How easy is it to actually lock down when you don't have outdoor space, or when actually you have to travel quite far to get to local parks? And then obviously this came into focus when places like Brockwell Park and Victoria Park saw an overabundance of occupation during the lockdown, and how the sort of local authority, due to years of austerity, wouldn't have the sort of tools to deal with things like that. So they didn't have civic enforcement officers and sort of environment or just like the community policing to be able to manage that process. So it's sort of thrown up lots of interesting I guess questions around sort of what, you know, the people's right to public space, the idea of the commons, the idea of these sorts of different mechanisms for managing public space as well, closed gardens. And I guess it also starts to talk around the sort of prevalence of privately managed or privately owned public spaces and who gets to control people's access to to these parts of the city.
I mean, I've been finding, like, personally, it's quite conflicting when you sort of go for a walk and, you know, there's this whole kind of rhetoric of people are sunbathing and people are sort of taking the piss quite hard, and it is a really hard balance to find, you know, what is the right thing for us to be doing in these spaces. And it's like, okay, you can't sit down, but you can, you know, it's like what is okay for us to do as individuals or collectively. You know, I walked past a group of people playing cricket last week, but they were wearing masks, but then they're like sharing their cricket bats. So it's kind of like, you know, it doesn't quite work in terms of, you know, that being okay versus not being okay. And I think, you know, kind of statistically, it's like gardens make up a sort of third of the land of the wealthiest parts of London, and like less than a fifth in the poorest parts of London. And yet, like you mentioned earlier, places like Brockwell Park or Victoria Park actually are like some of the poorest boroughs, and those are the parks that are being shut down, obviously because they are the most sort of used and most overcrowded. So people who do have access to private gardens, should we not be using our kind of public parks as much? Or, you know, what's the kind of individual and collective responsibility that this is throwing up?
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting about the scale. So it means, yeah, the idea that those who most need it are the ones who are having that sort of resource taken away, and those who need it least are the ones who are still able to use it. And it's also interesting when you look at on the continent where people were allowed to leave if you had a dog or you had a pet. And actually, again, there's a certain, you know, people who can afford to maintain a pet also were getting the ability to go outside, whereas those who couldn't. So again, and I think it's fair to say there's no easy options for anyone who's trying to enforce a lockdown as a local authority or as a government. However, again, it comes back to the point of who is making the city, and it's less about the lockdown, but more about it's a sort of these failings haven't been addressed in the sort of preceding 20 or 30 years of public planning. So, and it's about how do we build more resilient cities. So when you do have a shock to the system, it doesn't throw up so many sort of inequalities that we have. And I think what's also interesting for architects or for people in the built environment at the moment is it's actually in a way showing how important our role is. So for a long time, architects have been working quite hard to try and justify their existence. But actually, ironic if it was, or not even ironic, just a shame they would have to take a public health crisis to sort of focus the minds of people on the role of city making and the importance of making resilient, equal, fair, good cities.
I think like this, the kind of last point to make around this is really how we think about how we use these places, I suppose, and maybe that's a class thing as well, but I think predominantly we kind of can tend to think of parks as kind of places of leisure, but now we need to kind of not forget that how important they are for our kind of health actually, and that's why it's kind of critical that we see these places as being available for our physical as well as our mental health.
Okay, so
this one's me. All my friends will know what a massive Quartet fan I am. So Kieran Hebden is half Indian and recently has discovered his grandfather's records and has been sort of sampling a lot of Indian tunes, but this song is like from 2005, and I actually discovered Fortet through this video at a kind of short film screening, which just shows how pretentious I am. But recently I have a baby who's 4 months old, and I've been sort of doing my kind of daily 45 minutes sort of walking in my local parks, and there's something about this music video that I think really captures this sort of claustrophobic feeling of being watched or being kind of really constrained within an outside space. And when you watch the video, you'll know what I'm talking about. So this is really about kind of our rights in public space, and again, what impact this whole situation has on it. So new laws have been brought in, kind of probably the most restrictive laws on kind of collective and individual rights, definitely for our generation. And obviously there's a lot of sense for, you know, why this has been brought about, but the question is, I guess, how long these rights, this lack of rights last, and what impact that's going to have on sort of how we use our public space. So, you know, the kind of pop spaces, privately owned public spaces that Joseph mentioned earlier, has definitely been a conversation that's been had for the last few years. So that is private companies or people owning sort of public space. So the question is now, who is telling us what to do? Who is watching us? And how does surveillance work in this time?
Yeah, and I guess it's also interesting, the idea that the police are somehow occupying a digital public realm. So you sort of suddenly have police who are one sort of found a way of like collectively mobilizing the sort of neighborhood around having these like grass up your neighbor forms. So the Met Police and the various other police forces have started to introduce very quickly, but also this interesting, or this idea that they're sort of on the sort of using Twitter and as a way of like publicly shaming people into behaving. It seems like quite an old-fashioned sort of back to the stocks, back to this idea of like mass public shaming is a way of changing behavior due to lack of resources and this sort of the fear of people not meeting the laws or the new regulations that have been put in place. And I think it's not really a viewpoint in any way, but I think it is interesting if we do conceive of the digital realm as a piece of public space now, or starting to continuously see that sort of events like this, and the police becoming more adept and more interested in using that as a medium or using that as a space they operate in, how that changes policing, and especially the idea of policing with consent. So if people have read the John Ronson book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, so the outcomes of the shaming is often a lot worse than the actual act to begin with. And are we sort of starting a dangerous precedent by sort of using public shaming on digital public space as a way of like enforcing rules and regulations at this period?
And I guess that's kind of at a micro scale, but if you think about it at a macro scale, I suppose data has been tracked for ages, like, you know, Oyster cards about how kind of people are moving across cities. But obviously at the moment, not obviously, but people, at the moment, phones are being tracked to understand how much social distancing are people actually adhering to. You know, you hear of people putting their phones off when they're going for a drive to Hampstead Heath for a walk, you know, and again, at what point does this macro sort of surveillance start to impact how we are, you know, using our cities on an individual level?
Yeah, and I guess it's like, will people stop if the requirement to sort of trace people to sort of stop the spread? Would that mean that people end up becoming more collectively sort of agoraphobic to wanting to go outside? And how does that change? How does that impact things like the high streets if you've got less people using them for the future potentially, if they know that everyone will know where they are? And I think it throws up interesting questions around sort of again the regulations and sort of what realm do we have to is the impact of what tools we use to actually generate more equal cities. And I think architects becoming more sort of literate on how digital tools and how data shape cities is, I think, will be quite an important thing for the profession going forward, to understand the implications of that. Do you have to pack onto the next tune already?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so I picked this song for a few reasons. One, people read our first article will know that we're big fans of Tierra Whack. I think she's probably one of the most visionary, interesting artists working at the moment. It's a horrifically wanky thing to say, but I think it's true. And the video, I guess, is sort of an interesting example of state overreach. So here it's dentistry rather than the police. But there's also something interesting here about having to wear the right smile and to be sort of seen to be sort of representing the right sort of vibe in public. So here we go. It's probably also worth saying now that we'll be taking like song requests from the audience in a couple of songs' time. So if you have any tips you want to share and a song request, please use the chat bar to make those song requests and or tips, and then we'll draw on people to share that with them in the future. So just have that in the back of your minds. Okay, next.
Yes, a similar like kind of 100 characters to give a top tip about what to do in lockdown, and yeah, related to a song as we've been doing. So the next one sort of almost relates to the darkness of that previous video, and it's about how about you use your phone as a phone. So Jason, do you want to go?
Yeah, so I guess it's interesting, like the way that it's changed the way that people interact, and it's sort of the way people communicate and have sort of maintain social relationships. And then for a species that is inherently sociable, it's quite interesting to see the way that we crave into specific ways of communicating. But also it's changing the way that you might deal with things like community engagement or how youth centres are suddenly moving digitally. But again, it looks around sort of this idea that, you know, talking to a community group in North Woolwich where they the people literally don't have iPads, smartphones, or computers. So the idea that this community centre can suddenly go digitally, like everyone seems to think it's easy to do, actually we don't have a lot of the sort of technological infrastructure we are needing to sort of deal with this. And again, it's about how is it that we stop it so that these big shocks in the city or in the way that we live doesn't massively cut out lots of people from the conversation, for being sociable. And I guess there's something. So then there's also opportunities for quite nimble organisations who are, moving sort of community workshops online, like the Yard Theatre in Hackney Wick are still doing their youth theatre rehearsals, but just doing it on Zoom. But again, who are the kids that aren't managing to be part of that conversation, who aren't able to enter the room, the so-called virtual room?
I think there's obviously loads of advantages of how people are communicating in this way. And I guess the thing to really think about is actually what impact is this going to have on our social infrastructure moving forward. So there's a kind of fear potentially that actually we don't need these youth centres anymore because people are sort of doing it all online anyway. Like, why do we need a kind of physical space in the city to have people come together? Or and I guess the high street is quite an a good example for that. Over the years, high streets have been sort of diminishing, and actually its importance is more than ever is now. We can't just all switch to kind of constant online Ocado shops and virtual queues.
And I think there's an interesting idea about how do you use the digital to facilitate more physical and social connection once this is over. And there might be interesting.
Yo!
Right,
What
Jaden?
one?
What are you saying?
How has Jaden managed to unmute himself?
Who knows? Turn your camera on. So it's interesting, the idea that the sort of tech literacy of wider populations may increase during this lockdown. So those are why 95-year-old grandma is now on FaceTiming and WhatsApp chats and things. And actually, how can that be used to when this is over, engaging her more physically in society as someone who is 95 years old, and how into engaging in that way.
And I think the other thing. Oh, sorry. You go. Someone's. Sorry, Joseph.
No, it's right. And I think the other thing that's interesting is what it's been shown is when the mayor did his interview with Glamour, and how he's talking about it's actually also okay for this to be difficult, and actually you don't have to sort of front your way through it, and actually the idea of being cooped up and locked up actually isn't something that you should just take in your stride necessarily, and actually be able to just call someone in a traditional way, and not having to be chatting to 8 people or doing 20 people Zoom chats doesn't necessarily mean bring you more sort of together. And actually this old-fashioned phone call to someone you genuinely like might also be a thing to do.
So should we get onto the tune?
Yeah, let's go on to the tune.
So this is Nana Cherry and Natural Skin Deep. The video is filmed by this guy called Crack Stevens, and it's a full female production team. And part of the reason of choosing this is it's basically filmed in Beirut, and it has this really dystopic feel to it. But I just feel like we've sort of switched the way we're living. So usually when we're on the tube, everyone's on their phone, right? So you're in a physical space and people are occupying that digital space. And it feels like we've sort of swapped it around at the moment, where we're constantly living through the digital space, trying to occupy the outside world. And I feel like this music video captures that really well, and everyone loves Nana. Well, I love Nana.
Wait for that clip of the selfie. Okay, so it wouldn't be a talk with some public sector workers about a public service announcement. Obviously, the GLA love them, and it's probably something that ingrained into us. So obviously, there's lots of adverts going in to promote social distancing, and our public service announcement today is brought to you by Lady Lisha. Okay, so public service announcement brought to you by Lady Lisha. Next tip.
Tip 5: use your free time to make one brown friend, but it can't be one of us.
So this is about something we touched on earlier, which is around who gets to make decisions and how the city is formed or policy is formed around us. and whether there are enough experiences that are feeding into the way that we shape the city and people's. So talking around people's sort of cultural understandings of how people live, or the fact that people who grew up in certain types of housing density where we aren't necessarily given the voice, especially the British experience, given the voice in city making. And I guess this is also linked quite directly into the fact that you've got 13% of the population are ethnic minority, but 33% of those dying for coronavirus are from ethnic minority backgrounds, and how actually sort of long-riding impact of systemic racism and how people live and the poverty they're captured in and underlying health issues are all things that we need to resolve as a profession. And I guess more and more I'm thinking, or it's probably apparent, that the architect's profession probably isn't fit for purpose responding to quite a lot of these issues, as it doesn't really represent the stories, narratives, the experiences of most British people, both from a class and an ethnicity standpoint. And how do we then change the processes of how we build the city, where architects don't think of themselves as central players, but see themselves as part of a more sort of collective endeavour to shape the city around us.
I think there's been this really kind of strong narrative about all of us being in it together. And I think this is trying to debunk that. It's really not that we're all in it together. It's clear, like Joseph said, that the number of people who are dying from BAME backgrounds is remarkably higher in the UK, but like terrifying to see the kind of proportion in America. And Afua Hirsch has written some really, really good articles about this in The Guardian. And I really encourage all of you to kind of look at what she's saying. And I think she's become really a voice for our generation, people of colour in this country, is particularly bringing these sort of issues to the forefront. You know, personally, there's something about if as architects we're designing homes, there's, you know, different people use their homes very, very differently. And so, for example, Asian families, you know, there's a lot of intergenerational living, and this idea of not being able to see your mother on Mother's Day, you know, actually a lot of Asian families live with their grandparents still. And, you know, what impact does that have for people? You know, yeah, exactly. Just trying to say that people live in very, very different ways. And it's really important for us to kind of think about that when we're talking about the cultural difference of inhabitation at home.
Okay, so we're going to move to the next track.
So this, this is me. So this is Riz Ahmed's Long Goodbye. It came out quite recently, and it's the whole album is basically a sort of breakup with the UK sort of post-Brexit. So it's sort of themed around what a breakup feels like, and but it's to do with how he has experienced a breakup with this country. So it goes from anger to sort of frustration and despair to all of that. And actually we're only going to play a small clip of this, but this video is really, really haunting and really deeply dark. But I feel like Riz is, again, another voice of for British Asians especially, and is doing some really incredible things and writing incredible things, and I have a lot of time for him.
Tip 6. Reach out to your Brexit voting neighbour. You might need that bunting to wipe your arse with after all. Pooja.
Yeah, so I guess it feels like Brexit just it's not even a conversation at the moment. This is really talking about how people are kind of coming together in different ways, the sort of communities that are forming in response to the crisis, how people, I know in my neighbourhood or on my local street, suddenly you see people talking to each other out of 2 meters distance, but people are trying to kind of be more supportive and kind of getting together in new and different ways, which is quite an interesting change.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see how quickly people can form new networks and new sort of programs and ideas. And it's important for us to understand how they're forming the sort of networks and tools they're using to form, but also how do we make sure that these networks don't disappear after lockdown are over, and we embed this sort of slightly more community-led or community engaged way of providing at the moment sort of critical support, but actually in the future could be used to do many more progressive things. And then how do we change policy, or how do we shape the way that we distribute funding with the GLA, or how do we change the way that we think about processes that deliver city making that start to build upon these sort of more shared networks and shared processes. And I guess it all comes down to this idea that actually humanity or human beings are quite small and the sort of the different things that separate us actually don't matter that much. Actually, I guess there's a slightly utopian idea. There's a consensus of how we can build a city together, somewhere etched, somewhere in the sort of roots of a lot of these ideas. So I guess we're interested in that. How do we sort of make the most out of this?
And I guess a lot of Brexit was about the sort of nationhood or localism in many ways. And not that I'm saying Brexit is a good thing at all, but I guess what I'm saying is we're sort of at this moment where this idea that we can just fly across the world at any point is, that is not a kind of, it's not something we can do anymore, and suddenly you're much more aware of your kind of local, what it means to live where you live and who lives around you. And I think the other thing that is sort of coming out of this is the sort of tension between urban and rural areas in this country. Definitely this idea of like being able to go to your sort of second home in Wiltshire and bring your germs with you, or in Wales or caravan parks, and how this kind of, actually that tension in a way is increasing. It's not all positive in terms of how communities are sort of coming together. In many ways you're sort of creating kind of closer and closer neighbourhoods. So it's a kind of tough argument here.
And the idea of the sort of global against the local might not be a thing, and actually you can be both. So back to Heady One, somewhere in the grey between the sort of hyper local and the sort of internationalistic global way of thinking might be some sort of third, so God, sound like Tony Blair, the third way forward. We'll pop to the next tune. So this is Can't Hold Me Down by Kano and Popcorn. And just because this is like harking back to something we can't really do anymore. So there's sort of nostalgia. It's like 4 weeks in the chat of nostalgia about like house parties. But also it sort of is an interesting example of how you would, this is like a nice community vibe, I guess, and how music and so people's homes can become community spaces. And
before you play this, Joseph, sorry, another call out. So everyone, we want your requests. So give us a tip and give us a song request, and we're going to choose one to play probably after this. So get in your requests right now.
The audience request time. Okay, so I'm going to unshare my screen quickly. And oh my God, there's quite a lot of requests. Here we go. So here we go. So trust James Parkinson for the Regen team to write half an essay as his like pithy tip. That's a small joke. So we've got Pedro Gil's song request, I Like It by Cardi B and J Balvin. Shout out to the Latino, I'm sorry, my ignorance, A/X diversity, also from the album titled Invasion of Privacy. We've got Mitch Rossiter, who did God Bless Mary by Little Sims, fantastic lot of rapper dedicated song to her next door neighbour and Terrace House, who had to put up with a loud music making.
I do love a Little Sims.
Okay, so we might have to, I want to read out all of these, but everyone can read them, so I won't. So if
we've got King's Cross by the Pet Shop Boys from Will Bradley.
King's Cross by the, oh yeah. And we have
Julian.
So you've got Sykes to the song Spreading, and we've got
America, the Julian Lewis.
So you've got quite a lot. So I think what we're going to do is probably add this to the playlist. We're going to share with everyone all the song requests, and then we'll pick Mitch Rossiter. So can Mitch Rossiter unmute themselves, and you've got the floor.
Hi.
What's up?
So we need to explain like why I chose it.
Yeah, and what it means for lockdown. Yeah.
Yeah. So the song is about, like I said in the description, her thanking her next door neighbor who, when she was like growing up and making a lot of music, making a lot of noise in her bedroom as a result of it, her next door neighbor was obviously like really annoyed throughout the time, but never like called the council, never made a fuss. And like Little Sims is doing really well now. So this is her like thanking her for that in this song. But I think why it's relevant is that it's her like looking at when she grew up and like the people around her, like peripheries when she grew up, who kind of contributed to her being where she is. And so like now we're looking at the people nearer to us. I think that's like, it's kind of like the same perspective in a way. So looking, who are your next door neighbours? How are they impacting your life? Yeah, so it's kind of like neighbourly awareness, I think.
Sounds good.
So the last tip,
Don't keep calm and don't carry on.
so this is an idea around the fact that I guess it's sort of the notion of Britishness, or the sort of like the orthodoxy of Britishness of like 100 years of political system, ideology, Conservative Party ideology, tax and spend is all sort of being blown out of the water by this, and sort of the need to spend and the state to increase its scale in sort of all parts of our life. Potentially provides a reset moment for our society to think about how we rebuild everything in the future. I guess that's the optimistic way of thinking about it, and how now there's an opportunity to really get a grip on sort of the climate crisis, to really get a grip on the inequalities that have been so horribly exposed by this, and actually a moment to build, I guess, a more utopian and positive view of how we live our lives in the city that we live in. But then there's also so for example, there's the government have managed to almost house every single homeless person in temporary accommodation in the last 3 weeks. It questions why they couldn't have done that in the last 10 years. At the same time, I guess there's a danger that you end up having this deregulation and sort of free market junkyard sale on everything. This is a way of getting sort of growth by any means back. So I guess it's an idea of how do we collectively, as a profession, as a cultural built environment sector, use this opportunity to actually ensure that the city of the future is a much more equal, resilient place. So if another pandemic happens in however many years, we're not faced with the same issues as we're currently dealing with.
And just to quickly add on to that, it shows that in the times of crises, whether it's wars or pandemics, suddenly there's all of this kind of investment being made, and it's a question of why do we need these sort of breaking points to be able to be proactive and be radical. That I think it's a really exciting, not exciting, but it's like a really positive opportunity for the public sector as well to take more charge and be more proactive, rather than just always reacting to the sort of negative points in, be it, like you said, housing or sustainability and the environment, and rather than wait for another breaking point, why not sort of be radical about how we sort of address these issues?
Yeah, and I think it's also the narratives of old are sort of very hard for the people in power at this moment to continue advocating. So it's very hard for the Conservative Party to continue saying that investment in public services or the borrowing is somehow a really bad thing, no matter what. Because actually we've shown that when there's a public need, actually you can find the ability to work these things out. But these things, I guess, progress and positive change isn't inevitable, and it's on everyone that has some sort of influence, even in a small way, to find an opportunity to make some positive change. And often architects or people in the built environment see themselves as people without much power, but actually compared to a lot of the communities and groups that we work with, architects are very influential and have a lot of agency over sort of a lot of people. I guess, how do we use that collective agency to potentially shape a better future?
And I think, and someone, I think Will just commented saying, well, the public sector is going to be broke. And absolutely, I think it's going to be a really, really difficult time over the next sort of probably about 5 years for things to recover. But I guess it's, as sort of individuals or collectively, how do we sort of change the way we're living? We've become so used to having anything we want at any time, or doing whatever we want at any time. And I think partly the sort of next song choice is about this sort of being able just to remember kind of everyday joys and everyday living and how important that is.
Yeah. Okay, next song. Okay, so I'm sure we'll do something like this again. Thank you everyone for joining us for the last hour. Hope it's been insightful in some ways, entertaining, more importantly. And we will definitely be sharing a playlist, but with everyone's song choices on Spotify. So maybe we'll get the AF to tweet it out or something in the next day
Yeah,
or so.
absolutely. And yeah, thank you so much. I actually feel quite emotional after that last track. There's something about just like, yeah, going to the supermarket or seeing people on the streets outside that feels quite nostalgic and quite happy. So yeah, thank you everyone.
Okay, so we're going to leave you with a anthem of the #1 phone calling anthem ever made. Have a good evening, everyone.
Yeah, Joseph and I've been
get home.
singing this like all the time for the last week. It's been in our heads, so all of you need to do this as well.
Yeah, I was going to say get home safe, but if you're not at home, then you're probably doing something wrong, aren't you? Stay safe, everyone. See you later.